Good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And wow, a lot of good people here already in the chat room. Corky's here, Norman, Kathy Sue, and David. Raina Daris is here. And Robert Kovacs. Always good to have you, Robert. Thank you for your always cheerful attitude. And everybody else here. It's part of the solution, part of the answer. Everybody's been very faithful as far as following. I mean, I go and look at George Webb's channel, and of course, and I hate Tyrone, and I go and look at hey, come on, man. Deborah. Hey, Deborah. Hey, yeah, I go and look at Mark's. I've been looking at Mark Kulak's Housatonics ITS's YouTubes lately, and really powerful stuff. He just did an incredible deconstruct of the story of the first American, alleged COVID patient, and how the details that he's able to draw out are exactly what we need to debunk what appears to be a made up narrative. So. Yeah, but I see you guys in all the chat rooms everywhere, and bravo to you for being faithful to the folks that are broadcasting. I was thinking, it's been like 3 years for me. I see Mark is celebrating 2 years, and he's just crossed 5,000 subscribers and 1 million views on his YouTube channel. His first channel, Housatonic ITS, or Housatonic Live is called. So congratulations to Mark Kulak and his he's earned it. I mean, it's been slow for him. I think they've shadow banned him, me and a number of other people. I didn't know that word a year ago, but what it means is that they don't let your shows accumulate viewers the way that it would without putting some kind of a program, a damper, something that obscures it from normal sharing. So, because I believe that's the case, because I had nearly 12,000 on McDuff Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA, and they took that channel down. And it's been over a year, and it's just now I've been over 6,000. I'm at 6,800 now on YouTube, and approaching 7,000. But I'm saying, why did it take me a whole year to get to 6,000 when I had 12,000 when they shut me down? They're shadow banning. Corky's a stalker of intellectuals. Huh? Okay. Well, I'll try to do my part here. I don't really want to be called an intellectual, but on the other hand, I've kind of got the credentials, and certainly have spent enough time with books. I showed you this one last week, and I'm still reading it. Of course, it's was it 1,000 pages? Let me see. It's 800 and it's 953 pages. 953 pages, and the thing is that it's really worth it. Oh, thanks, ECAT. Yeah, so glad you're here. Yeah, I definitely have loyal followers. I'm just completely, floating on all the energy that you guys give me. Absolutely. So things are starting to get, closer and closer to my understanding of what's been going on. And the show tonight is McDuff, TDY, and the Rockefellers. So, we're going back to Laos in the 1960s, where the CIA has been running a secret war, and they're using the military, the special forces, mainly Green Berets, Same guys that are later going to be used in the Sante rescue mission. We're talking about General Donald Blackburn, Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, and the same people that have been participating in the Laos War then become engaged in the secret operations, of course, in Vietnam, including the Sante raid, which is the culmination of all their work. And after that, Blackburn is retires not too long afterwards, and they kind of blamed him for the fact that it didn't produce any prisoners. And from his point of view, it was a failure. Of course, General Leroy Manor, who was the next Saxa, for General Manor, it was a great success because it it showed him, we showed him we could do it. We could run a raid deep into Vietnam, North Vietnam, and although we didn't get any prisoners, he they claim that that caused the North Vietnamese to consolidate their prisoners into more humane and civil barracks. And you know, who knows what really went on, but the reports of Sante were turned into a success, even though from the military point of view, it was a failure. They didn't rescue a single American. But this tonight is going back to Laos, which is in the mid '60s, and let's start with Doug Valentine's amazing book, TDY. Um, this book is not only is it a great read, it'll take you it's about a 3 hour read, I'd say, but it also takes you deep into the minds of people who, on the one hand, are appalled and shocked and trying to stop the CIA's drug dealing, and on the other hand, the CIA itself, which, as they say in the end, they have their own ways of doing things. Um, so I wanted to direct your attention to this book, and please get yourself a copy of it and read it, because my dad's in the book. He is identified as Mr. Hammer, and Mr. Hammer is the man who basically recruits and clears Pete, the photographer, to go on this mission into the deepest, uh, Laos, with the idea that these guys, these Air Force guys, are going to actually catch the CIA engaging in the drug deal with the opium lords in Laos. And I can't give away the book except for the obvious fact that the mission failed, because if it had succeeded, then the CIA's drug dealing would have been exposed in 1967. And that hopefully would have caused the end of what's still going on now with our uh, drug rat lines and the newest drugs, fentanyl, and all the uh, great opiate and opiate derivatives that they can now get you hooked on in no time. So I wanted to, with Doug's permission, and I did ask him if I could read portions of the book, and he said yes. Although I do want to point out that there is a professionally recorded audio book of this book. So if you want to hear the whole thing, I would ask you to support Doug by listening to that. I imagine you can get to it on Amazon or on DougValentine.com. But again, this story ties my father into Saxa and the whole secret war in a way that I'm still reverberating from the amazing certainty that Doug has that this was my dad. So anyway, I want to read a little bit from the end of the book. Once again, you know that the mission didn't succeed, and that means that the CIA busted him at the end. And the person that busted him is called in this book Mr. Jason, Jason. And boy, I heard that. I've carried that around in my mind because there was a operation called Jason, which was run out of the Pentagon, which was a collection of supposedly really, really smart scientists that were put together to try to come up with thinking out of the box ways to solve problems that the Defense Department had. Uh, you know, so it's still a secret thing. I think they just recently shut it down, supposedly shut it down, but it was started way back in the 50s, and this was the name of this man that of course, they're all pseudonyms, so calling him Mr. Jason doesn't necessarily mean that he's associated with the Jason group. But when you hear the rest of the story tonight, I think you'll see why I'm raising the question. So at the end of the book, when that operation is over, and he meets again with my dad, and my dad, he's scared. He said, "Wow, is the CIA going to kill me? Because they've caught me now, and they confiscated the film and all, but they didn't do anything to him yet. But he was warned that the CIA is going to be after you." But then when he gets back to the States, he's debriefed by my dad. It's Pete, the photographer, and he's told, "Don't worry, you're covered." What do you mean I'm covered? What do you mean I'm covered? He says, "Well, this really never happened. No, none of this ever really happened. It's all been, you know, there's no paper. There's no proof that it ever happened. So just don't ever mention it, and you'll be all right." Well, I guess that's why Doug has maintained the secrecy of the identity of the characters in this book for so long, to protect them. You know, but one of them definitely told Doug this story. Well, the CIA actually offered him a job. They said, come and do this thing for us. We need some surveillance, and it's pretty safe. It's right downtown in Saigon, and you can work out of our office, and it'll be easy. But and he says to himself, "I didn't like the idea of being blackmailed into joining the CIA." This is on page 125 of TDY. Some contracts you can never get out of. And I suspected it was an attempt to guarantee my silence after the TDY mission, so I said, "No thanks." There were still other opportunities available. And next, Sam introduced me to representatives from Texaco and Mobil Oil. Of course, Mobil Oil is Standard Oil of New York. They were drilling for oil, and during dinner at the Continental Hotel, they talked about the concessions they had acquired in South Vietnam and Cambodia, and how business was booming. And it was then I realized we were fighting the war for them. I leaned across the table and said, "We're here to protect the mineral rights, right?" They didn't like hearing it put that way, and neither did Sam, and that ruined my chances of working for any of his business contacts, which are everywhere. Walk down any street in Saigon and you would see signs for Mekong Ford and Bank of America. There were Shell stations, which were never attacked, sitting beside false leg factories and companies that mass produced coffins. The U.S. Army was guarding the Michelin rubber plantation and the Nong Son coal mine. By the end of 1970, Union Oil, with the help of the Nixon administration, had bought up the concession to all onshore oil in Cambodia and was gobbling up the offshore concessions too. You might not know this, but not one American oil truck was ever sabotaged in Vietnam. Do you realize how much protection money the oil companies had to pay the Viet Cong? Do you have any idea what the VC used that money for? They called it Vietnamization, but it was really Americanization. There was just too much money to be made. There's the oil companies, and specifically, it's the Rockefeller oil companies, and the drug trade, which comes along with it, is just part of this operation to secure all of the resources, the oil and the minerals in Southeast Asia. Obviously, once you think about it, you realize, that's what we were really doing, was making sure that we would control it for our beloved multinational corporations that hardly pay any taxes because we love them so much. So now I want to move over here to the book Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil by Gerard Colby and Charlotte Dennett. And I'm moving all the way to, now we talked about this last week, and I'll just remind you that what this book documents is the tight relationship between the Rockefellers and various fundamentalist Baptist and other fundamentalist religious groups that are into evangelizing and into, spreading the good news, the gospel, to the Indians, the remote tribes in America. And of course, a great bit of this book is about Latin America, Central America, and South America, dominated by Nelson Rockefeller. But what that is a model for what happens now as we read from chapter 35 on page 546. And this chapter is captioned Apocalypse Now, the Tribes of Indochina, Battling the Hordes of Satan. Vietnam begins with a blast of hot air. The land takes your breath away as soon as you step out of the air-conditioned jet, as if already demanding your surrender to its climate, its ways, its ancient national will. Calvin Thielman could not see the mountains from Saigon's airport, but he knew that 100 miles or so away were the Central Highlands, where missionaries of the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, did most of their work. Now, the Summer Institute of Linguistics is the product of the combination of Rockefeller's money and the Baptists' fervor in evangelizing. And they found out that in order to get into Mexico and into a lot of other countries, they were banned from proselytizing. Mexico didn't want to hear it. We don't want you guys here, stirring up people with your religious exhortations. We don't want you here. Well, they figured out that they could get in sideways by being linguists, providing a service of learning and translating local Indian languages, of which there are hundreds around the world, as a convenience to the government, but what they do also is they are acquiring information that's going to help the oil companies to acquire the land and the resources. So it's kind of a, a, a backstabbing type of religious effort where they're going out into remote places that have no experience with Western cultures or values or trickery. And they get the people interested and excited about the Bible and Jesus and being saved and everything. But at the same time, they're taking notes and writing down, here's where the wells are, here's how many people live in this village. And all of that filters up into the hands of the State Department and the Rockefellers. So that's the way the game is played all over the world. And we're learning this in the context now of Southeast Asia. There, surrounded by tropical forest that hid the enemy, SIL translators labored over the linguistic secrets of some dozen hill tribes. Every time Thielman came to Vietnam, he made a point of visiting those brave bearers of the word. He could not, however, see the full scope of the impact of Bible translation work, which extended to tribes farther north in the highlands of Laos and Thailand. For Thielman, as for most Americans in those years, it was quite enough to see Vietnam. The land was the front line of the U.S. war in Southeast Asia. Beyond the flat lands of coastal Vietnam, the Central Highlands climbed up the steep Annam mountain chain that divided Vietnam from the Asian interior. Here, tribal peoples, who centuries before had been pushed out of the fertile flatlands by the Vietnamese, scratched a living out of stony soil and hunted the great forests. They lived without regard for the legal formalities of borders that obsessed the Vietnamese authorities. They crossed at will into the hills of Cambodia and Laos, where poppies had been grown since the previous century when the British used gunboats and modern armies to force its lucrative opium trade upon a resistant but weak China. Now, thanks to the CIA's secret war, opium bound for the European and U.S. markets was becoming the major cash crop. Cambodia and Laos were both officially neutral in the war, Cambodia by the design of its ruler Prince Sihanouk, and Laos by the 1962 Geneva Accord negotiated by Averell Harriman with China and the Soviet Union. But Laos's neutrality was fiction, and not just legally, as in the case of Cambodia, whose territory was also used as a supply line to the communist-led National Liberation Front, but militarily as well. Caught between efforts of North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh to ship supplies and reinforcements to his allies in the South, and U.S. determination to stop this aid while it armed its own client regime in Saigon, Laos, for a time, would become the target for more U.S. bombs than North Vietnam. Most of these bombs were dropped by U.S. planes flying from bases in neighboring Thailand, the projected industrial heartland of the subcontinent, and the inspiration of the most grandiose dreams of Western investors for Southeast Asia. During this period, Nelson Rockefeller and his brothers had invested in a number of companies through IBEC in Thailand, Siam Fiber Cement, one of Thailand's major industries, Thai Coconut Industries, which used coconut husks to manufacture upholstery fiber, Thai Celadon Limited, which produced high-fired stoneware for American and European markets, and the Thai Industrial Development Corporation, a joint venture with Denmark's East Asiatic Company. In addition, John D. Rockefeller III's importing firm, Products of Asia, had led IBEC into Bangkok Industries and his Design Thai operations, which provided Thai textiles for Lord & Taylor's racks of expensive clothes in Manhattan. IBEC's Thai-Bec Investment Service steered investors toward Thai opportunities for profits, including IBEC's own associated companies, Star of Siam, Silk of Siam, and Arbor Acres, Thailand. IBEC's Chicago-based insurance firm, Rolleback, had moved into IBEC's office in Bangkok in 1961 and used its Thai subsidiary to score commissions as general agents for reinsurance and life insurance companies doing business in the Pacific Rim countries. Rollebeck provided in-house insurance for these IBEC firms, as well as for the Rockefeller Foundation and such U.S.-financed nonprofit and international agencies as Planned Parenthood and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Its corporate clients included some of the largest American companies doing business in Thailand: Shell Oil, Colgate Palmolive, Kraft Paper, Eli Lilly, Upjohn, IBM, John Deere, 3M, and Far East Mining. Using Bangkok as the regional base, Rollebeck made quite handsome profits between 67 and 71 by tripling its portfolio and writing off over 50% of the purchase price as goodwill. Rollebeck expanded into Hong Kong, Seoul, Tokyo, and Yokohama, and Vientiane in Laos. It was also a war profiteer. Vietnam business generating much of its income. Its clients included Bird and Sons, which flew supplies from Thailand into the CIA's Hmong Army in Laos, supplementing the CIA's Air America, which also was a Rollebeck client. In 1971, the vice president of Rollebeck had hopeful words for Thai generals who had overthrown the government. This is a sort of an air of expectancy. There is a sort of air of expectancy as many people believe that the generals mean business. We can be mildly optimistic. IBEC would be using the guarantee of the State Department's taxpayer-funded Overseas Private Investment Corporation to insure its poultry farms in Thailand against possible losses. Nelson was aware of the economic stake. As far back as his involvement in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, the United States was interested in Southeast Asia. Eisenhower had justified U.S. support for France's efforts to hold on to her colonies as, quote, the cheapest way that we can get to certain things we need from the riches of the Indochinese territory and from Southeast Asia, unquote. Vietnam was, quote, the controlling hub, as Secretary of State John Foster Dulles put it, of an area rich in tin, tungsten, oil, rubber, and iron ore. As communist-led nationalist revolutions against Western domination spread from China into Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, the war in South Vietnam became a war for the entire Southeast Asian mainland. In this war, Thailand was not only a staging base for attacks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and North Vietnam, it was also Southeast Asia's industrial heartland. The hydroelectric foundations for the development of the entire 236,000 square mile Mekong River basin and the strategic gateway below the Himalayas to Burma and ultimately to the jewel of the former British Empire, India. By 1967, and by the way, 67 is the year of the TDY raid, the war had made Thailand the largest Southeast Asian country host to U.S. bombers, 20,000 U.S. troops, and teams of Green Berets and CIA officers. It also hosted the largest U.S. corporate investment in the region. Thailand had become the Brazil of Southeast Asia. U.S. mining and hydroelectric projects in Thailand were financed by such banks as David Rockefeller's Chase Bank. The country's giant Mekong River had become the object of vast development schemes, rivaled in the Third World only by those proposed for the Amazon. Calvin Thielman, who knew the President of the United States, understood why a Texas politician like Lyndon Johnson could not bend to Ho Chi Minh. The war was simply a test of wills. On one side stood all that seemed righteous, a Christian, Bible-quoting fellow Southerner leading the Western world's superpower in defense of a beleaguered ally. On the other side hid the hordes of Satan, stalking the jungle to murder and frighten peasants into submission, all directed by the inscrutable Ho, hundreds of miles to the north, who in turn was controlled by other evil emperors thousands of miles away in Peking and Moscow. There was no wondering why Vietnamese peasants should be willing to take on such incredible odds against so powerful an enemy as America and to suffer and die simply because someone hundreds of miles away ordered them to do so. Communist brainwashing techniques were legend. There was also the lack of Western respect for human life and the fatalism of the Asian mind, both alleged traits long detected by Western scholars and missionaries. It was all so oriental, so difficult for the Calvinist folks back home to understand. There's that word, Calvinist, for the Calvinist folks back home to understand. So different from what Reverend Thielman's congregation could feel. A patriotic outrage against foreign intrigue and threatened conquest of the little guy, who, being a member of our free world, was, as Ed Lansdale said of Magsaysay, quote, our guy, unquote. Some Protestant missionaries felt little hesitation about describing the war as a great opportunity to harvest souls for the Lord, giving out gospel readings to grim-faced Vietnamese draftees at Saigon's induction center. After his first visit to Vietnam in 1965, Thielman told a reporter that, quote, some of our military people are almost like missionaries, and the missionaries were almost like the military. Quote, I talked with 21 missionaries, Catholic and Protestant out there. Not one of them thought we should withdraw, unquote. They provide in the book here a really interesting map which shows where all the resources are and all the development projects. Walter Cronkite and the Evening News did not tell us about the Rockefellers' interest in the minerals and oil of Southeast Asia. We just heard about, the tragedy of our soldiers trying to fight a very difficult battle in the jungle against these determined VC guerrilla types. We didn't know what it was about. But that's what we're doing now, is we're explaining it. And Charlotte Dennett and Gerard Colby have done a great service by writing this book, which combines a study of Nelson Rockefeller with a study of the CIA's combination of oil company money with proselytizing Protestants and Catholics too. They got some Catholics involved too. But the idea that you would go out there and on the idea that you're going to save souls, but what you're also doing is you're making notes and sending them back to the mothership about how many young men of military age there are in this village and what the chief thinks about the Vietnamese or the Laotians or the Pathet Lao or whatever, the communists. That use of a religious cover for spying or use of a spying cover for proselytizing your religion if you really have the fervor of your faith and you want to proselytize even though you have to do it as a secret agent man. So as you know, the Americans were using the Montagnards as a proxy force to fight against the North Vietnamese and the Laotians. As the Montagnards' manhood was marched into the Holocaust, their replacements became younger and younger. By 1967, Sorchuk found boys under arms, quote, the proud possessors of a transistor radio and aspirin tablets. They were paid $12.71 a month. This was a cheap war for the CIA. It would continue despite enormous losses and long after the realization that the CIA's Montagnard army could not win. Unbeknownst to the missionaries, I'm on page 556. Unbeknownst to the missionaries, the Border Patrol Police and Thailand's hill tribes were being drawn into a financial web with threads that stretched back to the CIA station in Miami, the same station that recruited the Cuban exiles for the Bay of Pigs invasion. You remember that, JM Wave, right? Yeah, wave at H.W. Bush. Hey, H.W. down in Miami, pulling strings in Laos. At Chiang Mai, northern Thailand's most important trade center, the CIA set up one of its largest stations. AID's Accelerated Rural Development Program in Thailand built roads, but the roads became more of a boon for heroin smugglers than for the Thai army, whose clumsy armored units found the highlands rough going. Thailand's largest tribe, the Lahu, and another large tribe, the Yao, had followed William and Harold Young, Baptist missionaries turned CIA agents. Yes, you heard that right. Baptist missionaries turned CIA agents. In cross-border raids from Burma into China, the supposed evil force behind the revolution in South Vietnam. They reported by radio to a third missionary, Harold's son, Gordon Young, who translated their reports and turned them over to the CIA chief of station, who doubled as the U.S. vice consul in Chiang Mai. To supply the Lahu warriors with arms without risking American helicopters so deep in enemy territory, the CIA struck deals with the Shan tribal rebels in Burma. The Shan ran opium caravans southeast to Thailand and Laos and returned with weapons. A few extra weapons for CIA's Lao strike forces along the Burma-China border could easily be accommodated in these caravans. Like the Shan, the Lahu were a dispersed people. They grew poppies as their principal cash crop and were involved in the opium trade. Yet the missionaries kept their silence. Only the sheer ferocity of U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia forced Americans publicly to raise questions about what was happening in Chiang Mai. Let's also remember that Chiang Mai was the base of Michael Hand, the CIA half of the Nugan Hand Bank, which is the subject of Crimes of Patriots by Jonathan Whitney, one of the books I read in the first year of my show, McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. And I want to get that republished. It's on my list of things to do. It's a great book. I did do a 1 hour summary, which you can watch on my website, screamingospreys.com. And while I'm mentioning that, let's mention Jumping Mouse. Catherine, our great archivist, takes care of all my playlists at YouTube as well as at screamingospreys.com, and is faithfully reposting everything from YouTube up onto BitChute so that we'll always have it even if YouTube strikes it. Yep. Andy's got my website up there now. Thank you, Andy. And saw my book cover up there. I'm not sure how book sales are going. I don't know how to check. Maybe they'll just send me a statement sometime. But I looked on Amazon and I saw, there's only one review. So if anybody has read my book, please post a review so that it will get more notice. I understand that's the way to get seen, is to have a number of reviews. So if you've read it, please do. If you haven't read it, please take the opportunity. Nestled in the mountains of northern Thailand, Chiang Mai gave Americans stationed there a welcome relief from the hot, humid Bangkok. Thais had been noticing an increasing number of Americans arriving in Chiang Mai since 1962, when CIA missionary William Young began his Lahu raids into Laos, as well as China. Chiang Mai's status as the last rail terminal in northern Thailand ensured its growth into a bustling little city with even a new university, but there was an older trade, opium. By 1967, competition for the opium trade forced the CIA-allied Chinese nationalist exiles, who had dominated the trade since 1947, to intervene. Thai troops now flooded Chiang Mai to defend the North from the CIA allies they had always known were there. See, Chiang Mai is now being taken over by the combination of the CIA and the Chinese KMT, the Kuomintang army that has fled because of the victory of Mao Zedong in mainland China. So their army, or part of it, got stuck in northern Burma and Laos, occasionally raiding into China. But what they're doing there is surviving by using opium and guns. The troops now flooded Chiang Mai to defend the North from the CIA. They were also there to back up communist suppression operations along the Laos border, where indiscriminate napalm bombing and massacres had provoked Hmong tribesmen to revolt. To supplement the widening counterinsurgency operations, the Lahu were again called up in the hills, along with draftees from Thailand's two other poppy-growing tribes, the Akha and the Lisu. This was the backdrop for the CIA's and the Pentagon's interest in the hill tribes of Thailand and in Chiang Mai as the base of operations for studying them. At stake were not only the airstrikes launched against Hanoi from bases in northern Thailand, but the opium trade that paid for many of the arms used by the CIA's tribal and military allies in Southeast Asia's opium corridor. The opium trade moved southeast from Burma, through Thailand and Laos, and into South Vietnam, bringing money, corruption, addiction, and weapons. The lands it passed through were tribal lands, poor and potentially revolutionary, all of them requiring the careful collection of intelligence, all of them remote, yet requiring constant surveillance. Resting in the cool mountain air above the Ping River, Chiang Mai, with only 75,000 people, was famous for its old houses made of teak from nearby forests. It also sported 4 new hotels to accommodate throngs of tourists who were attracted by the local tribal crafts. Beyond these mostly Hmong hamlets, deeper in the mountains, dwelled tribes whose isolation was seen as a breeding ground for subversion and revolution. To correct that situation and to efficiently exploit the tungsten, manganese, and fluorspar lodes in the mountains south of Chiang Mai, the regime was rushing an accelerated rural development program to tie Bangkok to the backlands with modern roads built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Lyndon Johnson had descended on Thailand in Air Force One in 1966 to seal an accord that gave him 6 air bases to bomb North Vietnam. In exchange, he pledged money, arms, and technical assistance. Technical assistance was a catch-all. It included arms as well as the Tribal Research Center in Chiang Mai, engineers, as well as anthropologists and linguists. In the name of the United States and the Cold War, AID and Pentagon grants were given to discover why people in foreign lands were willing to join guerrilla groups and risk their lives. What local social political structure and dynamics, as well as the aspect of leadership resources, would be of significance to military operations, and how ethnic minorities could be mobilized instead to support U.S. intervention. Subsequent investigation by the American Anthropological Association's Ethics Committee uncovered the fact that anthropologists had been given a priority in the project precisely because their work required them to know the area and win the trust of its people. Social scientists began churning out studies on the hill tribes of Southeast Asia, extending their usefulness to the American war effort. Minority groups in the Republic of Vietnam, for instance, was completed in 1966 by the Pentagon-funded Center for Research in Social Sciences, CRESS, of American University, the same group that did similar studies for the Pentagon in Latin America. Tribal peoples became the focus of yet another social science think tank in Northern Virginia called Research Analysis Corporation, whose studies included, quote, the mobilization and utilization of minority groups for counterinsurgency, unquote. Brief notes on the Tahoe, Poco, and Phuong tribes of the Republic of Vietnam. The customs and taboos of selected tribes residing along the western borders of the Republic of Vietnam, and the major ethnic groups of the South Vietnamese highlands and their settlement pattern, social organization, and religious practices, unquote. The study on, quote, mobilization and utilization of minority groups for counterinsurgency could have offered the SIL's Dale Keatsman a few lessons on what the Pentagon and the CIA were looking for, assuming that a knowledge of CIA misuse of anthropological and linguistic data might have persuaded Keatsman to be less enthusiastic about identifying, quote, potentially hostile tribes and their locations on a map of the Brazilian Amazon. The Pentagon-funded study's stated concern was to target those tribal groups judged susceptible to, quote, subversion in future communist wars of national liberation because of, one, the history of a hostility between them and the dominant ethnic group, two, their location in remote areas and consequently their lack of close contact with the national government and its representatives, and three, the fact that they occupy terrain of strategic importance both to insurgent and government forces, and four, a combination of these reasons. World War II's legacy of the social sciences at the service of political power, pioneered in the cultural and intelligence operations of Nelson Rockefeller's CIA, had come to full horrifying bloom. In the summer of 1967, the Pentagon-sponsored JASON division of the Institute for Defense Analysis convened in Thailand a Thailand study group to see how it could quietly enlist the aid of academics in counterinsurgency without causing a scandal. One of IDA's 12-member universities, the University of Michigan, was already deeply involved in Thailand, seeding the jungle with microphones and seismic devices to distinguish natural varieties of background noise created by insects and animals from human movements so that troops, artillery, or bombers could be alerted. That university also trained Thai officers in aerial surveillance technology and the analysis of imagery at its infrared physics laboratory at Willow Run. To facilitate using the Tribal Research Center's resources and contacts, including its associated American anthropologists, linguists, and missionaries, the American Advisory Council for Thailand joined the Thai National Police in signing a contract with UCLA. The council's work was understood explicitly to be organized as part of the operations of the U.S. Overseas Mission. Operating behind the Advisory Council was another organization with a larger regional vision, the Southeast Asia Development Advisory Group, SEADAG, or CDAG. In fact, the Advisory Council for Thailand was the creation of CDAG. With CDAG, the chain of manipulation in the Southeast Asian War, running from tribal recruits to missionaries and anthropologists to AID and the CIA, finally ended. It ended where it usually did, at the top, where purse strings were held by policymakers who just happened to control larger purses, literally the deposits and debts of whole nations. These were powerful businessmen, and among their leaders were the Rockefellers. Well, the next section is called The Force Behind the War, and CDAG has been set up in the early 1960s as a counterpart to David Rockefeller's Business Group for Latin America. Its membership included the Rockefeller Brothers, Inc., Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of Indiana, and IBEC, which invested heavily in Thailand. Ironically, of the five Rockefeller brothers, the one who became the most associated in the public eye with CDAG was the least political, John III. Unlike Nelson with IBEC, David with Chase Bank, and Lawrence with Eastern Airlines, John III had no great personal business interest, much less one in Vietnam. He was the quintessential naive philanthropist. He was Mr. Asia, the leader of the Japan Society, and the founder of the Asia Society. Yet it was this status and this last organization that tainted the Rockefeller name. In the late 1950s, Young, well, you know what? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to save that part about, well, let's just summarize it. The son of missionaries, Kenneth Todd Young, had weathered a nationalist upheaval in China in the mid 1930s. Thanks to a teaching scholarship at Harvard, he became one of the best connected economic thinkers at wartime Washington's Natural Resources Planning Board and the War Production Board. Then, Young became a political intelligence officer in the State Department and later vice president of Standard Oil of New York, that is Mobil. Excuse me. It was Young who paved the way for American backing of DM during the Eisenhower administration, when he was acting director of the State Department's Office of Philippine and Southeast Asian Affairs. In fact, it was he who drafted Eisenhower's fateful letter to DM in 1954 committing U.S. support to replace the French colonialists. In the late 1950s, Young went to work for Mobil's subsidiary in the Far East. With his rarefied background among missionaries and oil executives, his credentials were attractive to President Kennedy's counterinsurgency experts at a time when the CIA's secret war was being launched in Laos. In 1961, Roswell Gilpatrick, Edward Lansdale, and Chester Bowles quietly nudged him into accepting the ambassadorship to Thailand. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to tie this all back together again, okay? So in the summer, this is on page 558. In the summer of 1967, the Pentagon-sponsored JASON division of the Institute for Defense Analysis convened a Thailand study group to see if it could quietly enlist the aid of academics in counterinsurgency without causing a scandal. Well, Project JASON is operating under the Institute for Defense Analysis. The Institute for Defense Analysis is a private company that puts together really smart scientists to try to solve problems that are needed to solve for national defense purposes. Within that is this board called JASON, which is these super smart scientists that come up with different ideas. But who are they working for? Well, they're working for Nelson Rockefeller. It's not a government organization. It is a private organization. Obviously, 1967, the Pentagon-sponsored Jason Division, active in Southeast Asia, convening studies of just the same type of things, the anthropological studies, the economic studies, the studies that are going to tell the military planners where the hostile tribes are, but also going to help the scientists figure out where the resources are. All of this is reconnaissance on behalf of the big energy companies, the oil companies. Who then was Mr. Jason in Doug Valentine's book, TDY? Well, you remember me talking to you about a man by the name of Richard M. Bissell Jr. Richard M. Bissell Jr. was about 10 years older than my dad. He was also from Hartford. His father had been the president of the Hartford Fire Insurance Company, where my dad's Uncle John worked. Also, the president of the Hartford Hospital, where they conducted a lot of creepy experiments, such as lobotomies. Just seeing how the brains work, open somebody up and have a look at their insides of their head. That kind of thing was done at the Hartford Hospital by Richard Bissell's father's staff. He grew up in the Mark Twain house, which is reputedly quite a creepy place in some people's imaginations. At any rate, the same Richard M. Bissell Jr. rose to being the deputy director for plans in the CIA, and he ran the operation in Guatemala in 1953 and 4, overthrowing the Arbenz government on behalf of United Fruit Company. And he ran the Indonesia invasion, in which people like Barry Soetoro's purported father were involved in isolating, finding communist and communist-oriented groups and getting rid of them. He was in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And he was fired by President Kennedy as a result of the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Well, what was his next job after Kennedy fired him? Well, he was allowed to resign, right? He resigns, and I see Andy's highlighted the Corona project, with Corona being a big word in our current events, right? But let's turn away from that and recognize the punchline for tonight's story is that when Richard M. Bissell Jr. was fired from the CIA, his next job was as director of the Institute for Defense Analysis. The Institute for Defense Analysis is where the Jason program is located. So once again, I find my father's chief nemesis, Alan Dulles. Well, I'd put Alan Dulles as the chief nemesis, but the number one henchman of Alan Dulles is certainly Richard M. Bissell Jr. And you can imagine that if it wasn't him, it was somebody else working for the Jason program that was able to snatch the results of Pete's work in the TDY mission in 1967, and was the reason why the whole thing was covered up. And that, I think, is a reasonable assumption that whoever created the fake names for the characters in TDY, and I suppose it was Pete himself, chose the name Mr. Jason. Well, I have my theories that that had something very much to do with Richard M. Bissell Jr. And once again, that small coterie of people that are simply willing to do evil to achieve their ends, and the effect that they had upon my father and upon this country is, it's still with us.